communicate. But the question is, what world results after those words? Let's look at a world presented by the side of proposition. From the beginning, it was deceitful and detached from reality. We heard a really nice tagline about how diversity can be a means of accepting people. Yet this failed to deal with basic analysis of how people are feeling alienated today because they don't speak the national language as well as other people because of indigenous, endangered language schools, and as a result, they clash with the rest of society. No logical analysis from their side. Instead, they shifted to talk about a protection of culture that they chose to obsess over throughout the entire debate. When state education had its basic purpose, as we explained from the beginning, of preparing us for the future. In response, we saw not a further defense of the sanctity of culture, but an attempt to say, let's add whatever words we want, which we think are functionally useful to society. A flagrant bastardization of the cultures they so seek to protect. They talked about stopping the persecution of minorities, talked about stopping the mistakes of the past, and yet their very policy of endangered indigenous language schools was going to lead to a lack of knowledge for socioeconomic uplift because the languages themselves couldn't accommodate it. In the end, trivial responses like, I can learn English, so I'm smart. I can learn 1 + 1 = 2. That's fine. Flagrant refusal to deal with the facts of what's happening in developing countries where people can't even get basic literacy and numeracy skills even before we talk about endangered indigenous language schools. And that's why by the end, it was a world of ignorance and neglect on side proposition. They chose to talk about a parallel logic with regard to affirmative action, which in fact promotes socio-economic progress, which is precisely what we were standing for on the side of opposition. They talk about governments owning up to the past by committing the very same mistakes of discriminating in a reverse fashion in favor of minorities and discriminating in a way which in fact prevented them from succeeding. That's why overall, the picture presented by proposition was a world as narrow-minded and bent stooped over as an ostrich, with cultural preservation as the only thing they could see stuck in the ground, when out there in the world, people were dying, people were suffering. They chose to be blind and look deeper and deeper and deeper into the mud. By contrast, what was the world of side opposition? Something far more sincere and broad-minded. A world which wouldn't disdain children of minorities to have a better shot at the future. A world which recognized that a bad foundation in national languages from primary school onwards, as their policy discussed, was going to result in people not having the skills, mathematically and scientifically, to develop and to uplift themselves, to gain true dignity and respect for their culture. They talked about culture for its own sake, but we refuse to accept that. We always focus instead on how cultures truly gain respect when their people can step up for themselves with the real skills they need. And that's why we also presented a far more concerned and holistic world. We also recognize cultural preservation might be important, but we balanced it as well with the needs for socio-economic uplift. We talked about how people can learn languages elsewhere, museums can preserve cultures for reliving subsequently, and we talked about how languages can be brought back to life. So we expanded our case where they chose to just stick to a single principle, which was in fact flawed. And we talked about how minorities are disempowered when forced into these schools, my second speaker's point they refused to respond to. So ultimately, they disdain from giving minorities the dignities of jobs, the dignities of uplift and progress. But we refuse to accept that. We always stood for people today rather than languages and faiths